Hello, everyone. Welcome to the SavvyCast. This is Jamie, and I'm delighted that you're here today, whether you're watching on YouTube or listening to the podcast. I've got a very special guest today, and we are going to talk about a topic that is quite serious. I have as my guest today, Dr. Jordan Vaughn. He is the CEO of MedHelp with a specialty in internal medicine. And he's the founder and president of the Microvascular Research Foundation. And he is going to explain what that foundation is. But I want to say at the outset that Jordan, Zane and I have known him since he was young. We watched him grow up, and we are overwhelmed with what he's become and what a service he's doing to so many that are suffering post-COVID, post-vaccine, who are having issues. And Jordan is overwhelmed with people who are wanting to get in to see him. And we have never once seen him turn anyone down. So he's going to take a deep dive and explain to us all that he is doing. And I hope that this benefits you in some way. Jordan, thank you so much for being here today.
Thanks, Jamie. It's really good to be here. I've obviously known you for a long time too. So it's very fun to be here having you interview me. It's kind of funny, actually. But anyway.
It really is. And your parents are right across the street, and we see you at all the holidays pretty much because we are very close to your family. Your dad actually started MedHelp, and you are carrying it along. But Jordan, can you just start by telling us, let's start with COVID. And then how that gets us to the point today where you are treating patient after patient after patient who, I'm not sure if this is the correct term, has long COVID or something that is related to their COVID experience or COVID vaccine. So can you just sort of give us an overview, and then let's dive in?
Obviously, I am a general internist that owns an organization that has about 200 healthcare workers. We employ probably about 18 physicians. So at the time that the whole world was being told to shut down, as somebody who was the leader of an organization like that, it required me to be pretty circumspect and kind of evaluate what was the best thing to do, not only to take care of all the patients that we take care of every day, but also to make sure that my staff, employees were not only safe, but in addition at that time, continued to be being able to have money and food on the table for their families. So it was a big undertaking for me, and it required me to take an approach that was very broad and allowed me to probably look at things different than your typical physician who was currently employed by a hospital system or an academic medical center. And because of that, it was very early that I started to see that there was a disconnect between what I would say the narrative that was among the media and the government agencies versus what was in the literature, as well as what the people that were actually fighting the battle on the front lines and actually researching what was happening was doing. And that is really what led me down to where I am today. And so in some ways it was, okay, throughout the history of diseases, as well as what we would call modern medicine, there have been very few diseases that the answer to that disease is wait, don't treat early, and until you can't breathe, don't do anything but sit around and keep yourself from anybody. In fact, that kind of goes against everything that we've learned in modern medicine. But even in medicine before modern medicine hit, it was interventions that were the things that would help and cure. And then on top of that, just being sick and being isolated. Isolation is never good for anybody, especially even isolation to the point of almost being in solitary confinement, almost like a jail sentence, is never good for anybody's health or anybody's psyche either. So it was very contrary to anything that I had ever seen. And that was what, led me to question it and really go against it.
And Jordan, you were just one of a handful of physicians who had this perspective, correct?
Yeah, I think there were more people that probably had that perspective. I will say the current environment of medicine is one that most of the doctors are no longer their own employees, meaning that they aren't self-employed. Instead, that they have to go along with what the academic medical center or big hospital system is telling them. And the problem with that is it gives them very little flexibility to question the narrative.
So, Jordan, and I'm privy to some of what happened because of just knowing you, and here we have a lot of mutual friends who had extreme cases and who left the establishment, some very fine establishments, and had to come to you, or they likely would not be here. And that's from their own mouths. What did you see happening that some of the hospitals, the larger hospitals, were doing that were not working, and that people probably or likely could have had serious consequences, but then they come see you, and what did you do to get them back?
First thing it was is that they were telling them to wait and do nothing until they couldn't breathe, which
Now,
again,
this is post-COVID diagnosis, correct?
post-COVID diagnosis. And so
Okay.
one of the things that I did was set up where you could get tested in the parking lot. But the other thing that I included in that was that if you did test positive, we would have you come in and actually get taken care of with multimodal medication. So from anything from antivirals to monoclonal antibodies, I probably gave out some of the most amount of monoclonal antibodies in the state at the time. Again, it was much more useful the earlier you intervened. And so as I was doing that, as well as the further that we read, as well as more and more people started to show up with disease that was even worse, it really forced me to, even dig further, reach out to people throughout the world and come up with solutions that were more in line with actually the disease process as opposed to what was politically convenient.
To clarify, were you all administering the mRNA vaccine?
We never really did. Probably it's probably the January of 2021. First of all, we really didn't have access to it because it mainly was sent out to the academic medical centers. But within about 2 to 3 months, I started to see my own patients that had gone and gotten the vaccines, and they came back with complications in people that were otherwise very healthy. And so I knew their history, and it was pretty significant to see what had happened, and it was pretty good signal that there was a problem. And I will tell you that it already was that way to begin with, because what we knew about COVID, when you actually dug down and saw what was actually damaging the vessels and causing the coagulation issues, the blood clotting issues, they were related to what we would call the spike protein. The spike protein is the thing that you probably heard about in lots of different settings. But the spike protein, if you ask any physician what makes COVID the worst, meaning like it's very different than your typical flu, it's that unique property is the spike protein is thrombogenic, it's cytotoxic, it's vascular. I mean, it basically causes vascular damage, endothelial damage, the lining of the vessel. And that's a lot of what the problems were. So it was interesting that the goal of the vaccination program was to actually have your body make that protein, but not only make it, but make it in a stabilized form. Stabilized meaning harder for your body to get rid of, so that you make antibodies to the thing that was already what we knew to be damaging. So typically, just kind of, again, probably getting ahead of myself here, when we talk about vaccination or vaccines, usually what we do with vaccines, first of all, we usually never vaccinate in the midst of a pandemic. We usually wait until everything's calmed down, because the last thing we want to do is vaccinate, because vaccines always have the ability to cause what we would call variants that come in the context of pressure, meaning that there's still replication going on in a large part of the population. The other thing is we usually inactivate or use parts of the virus that are not the damaging parts. So when you see viruses that say inactivated virus or protein subunit vaccine, those things are vaccines that are not using the thing that we know is damaging. Instead, it's utilizing things that aren't as damaging and utilizing those antibody responses to get rid of the virus before it happens. And this wasn't the way that it was pushed out. So at that point, it was pretty obvious that something was a little amiss, because that's not the way we would have typically vaccinated a population. First, we wouldn't have done it in the midst of people still getting infected. Second of all, we usually wouldn't have given people the thing that is cytotoxic and damaging to the vasculature. Third, we wouldn't have given it in an active form. Instead, we would have given it passively meaning your body interfaces with it. And instead, this is what they were proposed to do was to actually have your body being a machine that made a foreign protein, which is not necessarily anything we had ever done, nor as my new, as my friend over the last year would say, and he said it multiple times in congressional hearings now, the former CDC director, Dr. Robert Redfield, is we really probably need to put this mRNA technology on the dustbin of history for vaccinations.
Okay, and I'm going to ask a few practical questions because there's so much that we need to talk about. Much to our regret, Zane and I both had the vaccine, and we had Pfizer, and then I know there was Moderna. Were they all the same? I mean, is there any differentiation for people out there who also might have regret?
So they all involve the spike protein. I will say that mRNA technology was not in the Johnson & Johnson. The Johnson & Johnson was what we call an adenovector. So it was utilizing a monkey viral capsid to actually have your body, make the spike protein as well. But the goals were the same, which was to have your body make the spike protein. The problem is it made it in everybody differently for an unknown amount of time and an unknown amount. And then your body was supposed to make antibodies. And that was the theory. It obviously didn't work exactly like they thought it was, but that, so in that sense, yes. Now, I will say that the vaccine that is not like any of those, and it was the vaccine that was not favored, and I know this even just being friends with Dr. Redfield, obviously at the time, Dr. Redfield was in the White House, and him and Deborah Birx were in favor of the Novavax, what we call the protein subunit vaccine. And that's a passive vaccine. It's a one that doesn't have as many complications. I'm not saying that I advocate for it at all. They were both virologists, and they were overridden by a immunologist known as Dr. Fauci and a oncologist. Not sure why he was involved, but his name is Peter Marks, who's head of the FDA. They really wanted the mRNA vaccines to be the end all be all. Now, the virologists both thought it was a little foolhardy, and they ended up being both correct.
It was a hierarchy
Politics.
or
Yeah.
political decision.
Yeah. Political and probably financial. The other thing we know is that the mRNA technology, half of the royalties from it go to the NIH. And the NIH is last year has paid about $400 million in royalties. So,
Wow.
and there's only 230 scientists at the NIH. So you can do the division, 230 scientists getting $400 million. That's not a bad gig.
Are they still getting profits?
They'll get and they're not profits, they're royalties. They don't even have to report them. It's a very interesting, it's quite an interesting, that's why we really don't know who actually got all of them. We just know how many scientists there are and how much money actually was sent. Now, how it actually is divided up, that we will never know, because that is actually not even reportable. And that's how messed up our regulatory agencies are, including the FDA.
Because here are patients of yours that are coming in, they've gotten the vaccine somewhere else. You're seeing these issues. Were some of the biggest issues them having COVID, or was it post-COVID?
It was easily both. And I will tell you the story, how it happened to me to get into this was, as I became well known for taking care of people with acute COVID, I guess, again, the network of people in Birmingham is one that allows people to all of a sudden, the people that had bad COVID or a reaction or anything like that, to also come. And so then that kind of required me to say, well, now I've got to not necessarily rethink, but utilize my own kind of medical knowledge and understanding of what's currently happening in acute COVID and relate that to what might be happening in vaccine injury or long COVID. And it is. I mean, again, we're talking about, some of the things that get sped up and cause damage in acute COVID are not that dissimilar from things that are associated with vaccine injury or long COVID. And so that led me down the road of saying, I wonder if we utilize some of the same principles where we think of the spike protein as something that's damaging to the vessel. I would actually call COVID not a respiratory disease. In fact, it's not. Even when people are told that they have COVID pneumonia, they really don't. Pneumonia is a word that basically means there's something abnormal in the chest. The problem is we all associate pneumonia as being a bacterial issue with the respiratory part of the lungs, what we would call the airways. But instead, what was actually going on was damage to the vasculature or the parenchyma of the lungs, and that was actually what was causing the oxygenation issues. So the same principle applied, but instead, a lot of these vascular as well as immune issues were not just in the lungs. Instead, these were later phenomenon that started to present themselves afterwards, but they were causing issues from kidney disease to heart issues to crazy issues in all of other parts. I mean, again, your body is basically, it needs oxygen, and the way it gets oxygen is through the vessels. And if the vessels aren't working, all of your systems can have issues.
Well, Jordan, so many people, at least that I heard of, and some I knew, were being put on ECMO machines.
So
Does,
ECMO machines was probably the best thing you could do at the time. The problem is by the time they usually got to the ECMO machine, they had been put on the ventilator, and the ventilator just beat up the lungs even more. But at that time, what you wanted to do was to preserve the lungs and actually use the ECMO. So the ECMO would be the bypass in a sense to the lungs. And so the other thing that ECMO required was a lot of anticoagulation. So when people were put on anticoagulation, that actually helped them as well, because that's a lot of what I do is utilize blood thinners, because again, this virus and then the spike protein itself is very fancy word for meaning clot making, is called, we call it thrombogenic. So it is one of the more thrombogenic viral proteins or viruses we had ever seen.
well, Jordan, if we had the vaccine, anyone listening or watching, can you go somewhere and be tested for spike proteins?
So we don't have a great assay yet that actually looks for the protein itself. What we utilize a lot of times is what we call the antibodies. So imagine that you have a protein, your body makes antibodies to it and antibodies. And so a lot of times what we're looking for is how high your spike protein antibodies are. And so that's a good way to assess how we use it as a surrogate marker for how much spike protein there is. And so typically, if you have an acute response, your antibodies should go up and then they should slowly go down. But in a lot of these people, the antibodies stay even above the threshold for us to even tell how many they're, meaning it's like greater than 25,000 or greater than 2,500, and it stays like that in perpetuity, which is means a lot of times means that your body is still continuing to be exposed to that spike.
Is there anything you can do if you know they've got high antibodies to bring that down?
So there's a lot of different things that we know are spike sequestering. And so those are things, the natural stuff that we utilize are things like nattokinase, serrapeptase, which are enzymes that are fibrinolytic, things that break down fibrin. There's lots of things like bromelain, curcumin. There's things like Natalgis, sativa. There's lots of natural things. And actually, one of the people I would go to is look for Peter McCullough's. Peter McCullough has a lot of what we would call natural spike defense or spike detox in a sense. And a lot of that is natural and you can access it on your own.
Mhm.
There's a lot of other things on the pharmaceutical side that we utilize. Those obviously you're going to have to talk to a physician about, but there's not, again, a lot of this stuff we're just utilizing off label because there's not really something that's proven to be spike sequestering yet from an FDA perspective.
So, would it be safe to say that the problem you're trying to help solve and your colleagues now in this day and age is long COVID?
So it's long COVID. And I think long COVID, unfortunately, is more of a pejorative term because it minimalizes the actual issues. But long COVID is really, it's the sequela or the after having the virus or after having the vaccine, your body is unable to deal with the effects of it. And so instead you have continual vascular damage, continual immune damage, yada, yada, yada. And so that's a better way to think about it. I think sometimes we use these words and sometimes it's easy for physicians to just say, oh, you have this. And then you ask them, well, what do I do about that? And they say, well, I don't even know what it is. I mean, that's not that helpful. So it's more of, I look at this thing as kind of post viral illnesses. And we've had those for a long time, but COVID has made it where it's not just this random person, because again, people used to get mono or Epstein-Barr and they would never recover from it. People might get Lyme disease. There's different, what I would say, exposure-based diseases that their body doesn't clear in the same way that other people do, and they have what we call residual effects from it. And these residual effects can be quite debilitating. And then you throw in that COVID or the spike protein from the vaccine is one of the most toxic, in a sense, immunotoxic, cytotoxic, vasculotoxic proteins we've ever seen. You're just setting yourself up for a disaster. And that's what we see. There's a ton of people with effects that are pretty, from, young 15 to 20-year-olds dropping out of school, being bedbound, all the way to lots of older people, their family members assuming that they've got dementia or Parkinson's or, Alzheimer's. So
Jordan, give us an example of some of the things you're seeing over and over. Just give us a patient that's representative of some of the symptoms, some of the complaints that may be dismissed or not understood in context post COVID by some physicians who do not see things or understand things the way you do. Share what you're seeing and then how you are handling that at your clinic.
one thing that we've learned and we continue to learn is obviously long COVID is a very large basket. And so there are effects that are different in the 65-year-old that are different than in the 15-year-old. And there are also areas of the body, the vasculature is a good example, is the older people seem to have issues in the small vessels of the brain and in oxygen delivery. So meaning, more cognitive issues, some fatigue, might have chest pain. The younger people a lot of times have more issues in the venous side. The venous side is the veins. So a lot of people don't even, medicine doesn't even really care about the veins, but the veins typically have been thought of as just cosmetic. But the veins are actually hold about 70% of your blood volume. And so if those veins are not getting blood back to your heart, it can cause a significant issue in multiple domains, from chest pain to shortness of breath to leg heaviness to waking up unrestored, to all blood clots in the legs, to urinary urgency, to all of the kind of things that might happen if the blood below your belly button just stayed there and didn't was had or had a harder time getting back to your heart. And that's what we call venous disease. Typically, I mean, a good example would be, I would probably break it down into the typical 18 to 25-year-old female or male that come in, and they historically were extremely athletic. Used to, some of my patients ran collegiately at big SEC schools, and all of a sudden that they can no longer run. But even then, a lot of times when they get pushed harder, they actually get worse. And so some of the things that go along with that is what we call post-exertional malaise, or PEM. And PEM is, all of a sudden the doctor says, hey, you just need to exercise, but you're saying, hey, when I exercise, not only do I not feel good when I do it, but I almost can't get out of bed for 24 to 48 hours. That's what we call post-exertional malaise. And that's not what the typical doctor would say, well, you're just lazy, but it's not. It's a physiological issue that is happening. And it's amazing to me to actually figure this out. I figured it out in young people that were college athletes. So these people weren't depressed. They weren't 50 years old and a little overweight. These were people that were at the prime of their life. And all of a sudden, their trainers are coming and saying, look, the harder we push this person, the worse they get. And that's all of a sudden saying, hey, this isn't just in their head. This is some physiological issue that's developed. And what we found in those people is a lot of them were having venous issues. So again, 70% of your blood volume is typically in your veins. The venous system is low pressure. So imagine again that your arterial system, which is what we always focus on in medicine, that's where we talk about your blood pressure. Your arterial system is high pressure. You have a pump for your system. It's called your heart. Your venous system is low pressure, actually. And so when we talk about your blood pressure being 120/70, your venous system pressures are like 10 to 20, like very low. So it's impacted by gravity. Additionally, there's no pump for your venous system. Actually, the pump for your venous system is moving your legs. And so in a sense, a lot of these people wake up very, with leg heaviness. They feel unrested. But again, guess what you don't do while you're asleep? For most people, you don't move your legs, so you get a lot more venous pooling. And then a lot of times when they're trying to run, your heart is a pump and it needs both an output. So when you're, exerting yourself, you need cardiac output. But if you don't supply good input, your heart becomes like a pump that cavitates, where you got a pump that you're trying to pump fluid out of and you don't have anything coming in, the pump starts to go crazy. Now, the problem is most of these people go to the cardiologist. There's nothing wrong with the actual pump itself, meaning that their coronaries are fine, their heart muscle's fine. The typical stress test or anything the cardiologist does, it looks completely normal. But they sit there and say, I don't care if you think it's normal. I don't feel normal. I can't breathe, yada, 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 yada. And that's the problem with everyone's looking at, hey, how's the pump doing? And the pump actually is fine, but if you don't give the pump adequate supply, the pump's not going to pump right. Does that make sense?
Yes. So what, and did the cardiologists typically look at any kind of veins?
They don't. And well, I mean, most cardiologists are focused on heart failure, coronary disease.
Right.
And a lot of times that is all based on the classic lipid hypothesis. The problem is most of these 25-year-olds that used to run college track aren't people that have coronary disease. So I mean,
Yeah.
they're kind of already fit. So when they get pushed down that pathway, most cardiologists aren't expecting to find anything that crazy because it doesn't really make sense to begin with.
And Jordan, I'm just going to, and I just want you to share this because Zane has a friend, and I don't know him personally, but Zane has shown this to so many people. It's a text from one of his friends whose son had been to myriad doctors at some of the finest institutions and was still not getting better. He had the heavy legs, played football, I believe. And this dad said, Zane, we went to Dr. Vaughn, who sent us to, I want to say it's
Something like an MRV locally. And then a lot of times we'll end up, the person that actually does so a lot of the younger people have venous compression. So imagine that there's a highway out of your pelvis and the highway gets blocked off. And so when the highway gets blocked off, all the back roads get filled, and those filling of back roads cause issues as well, from urinary urgency. In women, it causes heavy menstrual cycles and pelvic pain, to hemorrhoids and GI symptoms, to sacral back pain. So those are areas where all of the kind of, imagine again that the highway gets closed off and everybody's getting off the highway and trying to find a way to get around it. All of a sudden that traffic there is not typical for those back roads, and those back roads get dilated and congested. And that causes pelvic venous congestion. And if you open the highway back up, which is what Brooke does, who's my colleague in Colorado, about 160 people now with this and had really good results. Now it's not 100% perfect. I think there's still a lot we've got to learn, because the veins in young people, it's a little bit easier because I think it's usually just a venous compression. But as people get older, it's more all of the veins aren't working. Imagine that your veins need to be, your veins need to contract and relax based on your position. And if they don't do that, everything pools, especially when you're upright. So a lot of these people will tell you, hey, I can walk. I feel pretty good when I walk, that I feel better. And then if I stop walking and talk to a friend for 5 or 10 minutes, I feel like I got to sit down because I get woozy and I get short of breath. Well, imagine when you're walking, the pump's working. Okay. And then all of a sudden, what should happen is your body should, when the pump turns off, then the vessels should constrict a little bit to keep that blood going back to your heart. But instead, if that's not working, everything pools, and then your heart doesn't have blood, your brain doesn't have blood, and you're just like, oh, I need to sit down. I feel dizzy, or does that make sense? And
yes.
so,
And Jordan, the Colorado, your friend in Colorado who does this, back to what this dad told Zane, he said, my son was sent there, had this procedure done on this one sort of
iliac, yeah, it's called the iliac vein. So
iliac. And he said, Zane, had he not gone to see Dr. Vaughn, I don't think he would be here. And I know that is the best of the best scenario, but what did Dr. Brooks do to the iliac vein? And is that what saved this young man, in your opinion?
again, so that's what I'm talking about. That highway is closed off. So there's an artery that comes over this vein. And again, the vein is the venous system's low pressure. And imagine that the veins are more like boiled asparagus versus like arteries are more like celery. Boiled
Mhm.
asparagus, all floppy, right? And then you have like celery kind of going over boiled asparagus. Well, it's going to be easy for that to compress that vein. And if that's compressed, then it's going to limit, the highway is not going to be able to get all the blood flow back to the heart. And so she goes in and actually puts a stent in. And once that stent, it opens up that vessel, not only do the legs get significantly better because there's not venous congestion, the blood's not stuck below the belly button, but then the actual heart gets a bunch of nice new, not new, I mean, venous blood is bad blood, it's old blood, but the blood is able to get back to the heart easier, which actually makes everything work. So again, medicine's all focused on the arterial system. And don't get me wrong, the arterial system, if the arterial system's not working, you go to the ER, you can die that day. The venous system's not working. It's kind of like your sewage system. So imagine in your house, if you got there today and your water wasn't working, well, you'd know it pretty immediately. It would take you a few days to figure out your sewage system isn't working. But when you find out it doesn't work, it's caused a lot of damage, right? And
Mhm.
so it's a little bit like that. Medicine's all focused on the things we can immediately find out. The venous system or the sewage system is just as important. In fact, probably never live in a house the sewage system doesn't work.
But Jordan, if someone if someone watching or listening, they're having these persistent symptoms, heaviness in the legs, all of these things you've mentioned, are there a handful or how many doctors would you say around the US or wherever would actually test like you're testing and then provide a solution that would clear up the symptoms and get them restored as best as possible?
Yeah, ones that I know, I mean, there might be five, but there's probably more, like probably under 50. And but that's the importance of what we're doing with even now. So again, what me and Brooke now have done is 100 and I think 160 patients is we've got to get that data out so other people will see it. Now, the unfortunate thing is in this kind of world, I mean, I'm a private practice physician. I don't get a bunch of state money to produce my results. But I don't have a statistics department right down the hallway
Mhm.
from me or anything. But that's what we're doing. So me and Brooke are, we're spending a good amount of money just to be like, look, this is so important. We got to get it out there so other people will do it. Because until then, in medicine, and that's again what's probably wrong with medicine, is everyone has been tricked into thinking that just randomized controlled trials are all that matters. And in reality, randomized controlled trials are good, but especially when we talk about surgical interventions, you're never going to have a true randomized controlled trial, or you might, and it might cost millions upon millions of dollars to do. You're going to go with more observational studies, and 140, 157, 160 people as an observational study, it will be pretty powerful. And once we get that out there, I think more people will do it. But until then, it's very new. Actually, my colleague at Emory, her name's Alexis Cutchins, she's a cardiologist there, and me and her and Brooke are kind of the three musketeers in this. We actually went to May, we went up and met with the Senate Help Committee in DC, as well as the head of the NIH. The head of the NIH, of course, was interested. And as well as the National Heart and Lung and Blood Institute. But they typically live in a world of kiss the ring academic medicine, which is not necessarily conducive to this. As we continue to help people, that's the biggest thing. I'm not sitting here saying I want any more patients because I don't necessarily need any, but it'll be very hard for your typical physician to figure this out until we get a lot of the research out there in the journals.
Well, I know that Zane and his world of his occupation has a lot of clients who have flown here to see you, who they have that money, the privilege. But for people watching or listening, and they're like, I have these symptoms. Obviously, there's no one near me. What do they do? Do they?
There's a couple things that you can do on the when you talk about venous blood not working very well, and the venous system is low pressure, so it does matter where your heart is in relation to your legs. And so a lot of times, instead of running on the treadmill or biking upright where your heart is well above your legs, if you do things like recumbent biking or rowing, the other thing that we find is people, it's almost diagnostic, but if you put these people in a pool, and not necessarily a pool to swim, but a pool to walk around and run where their water's up to their chest, they will feel much more normal. And again, because the weight of the water is pushing on the veins and pushing blood back toward their heart. Other things are intermittent compression devices, things like Normatec type boots. You can get them for fairly cheap on Amazon. They're called Fit King. And utilizing those, especially before you go to bed, to almost dynamically squeeze the blood from your feet all the way to your thighs to, again, allow you to sleep better, but also wake up not as exhausted. And our theory on that, we don't have it proven yet, is also the best thing that you can do to help heal these vessels is move blood away. Because if old blood, especially venous blood, that's low oxygen, coagulable, and inflammatory sits there, it's not going to be helpful to have those veins heal from the damage that's occurred because of COVID or the vaccine.
It's blood flow restriction.
So it doesn't. So it's very different. So blood flow restriction is a different concept in physical therapy. These people probably don't benefit from blood flow restriction because they already have restriction.
You're right.
And instead, yeah. So it's almost like they need blood flow going back toward their heart. So instead, it's more dynamic.
But Jordan, some of your patients, aren't some of your patients like we have friends, and we were in California, and it was a husband and wife that we were at Auburn with. We used to go to church with. They were telling us that you helped both of them. One, I think, had it in her lungs. The other had it, her husband had it somewhere else. And you put them on these different supplements and protocols.
So the venous stuff is the venous stuff. The other thing that happens, especially in is more of the small vessels. So the arterioles, which is basically, again, that's when we were talking about the arterial system and getting oxygen out to tissues. So in those people, if red blood cells aren't able to get out in the tissues, and when you think about the smallest of vessels, imagine that the red blood cell, which again is the thing that carries oxygen, there's other ways that your body gets oxygen. One of them is dissolved oxygen, so oxygen that's dissolved in the plasma. But as humans, we're designed to actually we have what we call a dense delivery mechanism, which is our red blood cells. So if the red blood cells can't get out to the tissues, and again, imagine the smallest of vessels are basically where your red blood cells line up in a line. And so if you have damage to those vessels, as well as fibrin aggregation, like what we would basically call sludge, or microclotting out in those smallest of vessels, you're going to have a lot of issues with getting oxygen to those tissues, which are going to make you quite fatigued. It's also going to cause you to have lots of brain fog. In addition, dizziness, palpitations, a lot of things that are just signaling to your body that you're not getting oxygen appropriately out to tissues that need it. And so that is more of what I would call the microvascular and arterial small vessel. And that seems to happen in older people, but it happens in young people too. But again, it's still a vessel that's having issues. It's just a different vessel.
How do you
So,
test for microclot?
so looking at it under the microscope. So again, we know that the fibrin that is formed in this COVID, we call they're fibrin aggregates. We call them microclots. We know that they form in an abnormal way. And so when we were able to stain the blood and look at it under the microscope, it usually immunofluoresces, so it lights up. And so that's how we look at it here.
And then let's say someone tests positive, they've got lots of microclots. What is the best protocol or the protocol that you're using to treat that?
So typically on the supplement level, a lot of the things that are helpful are what we would talk about, the nattokinase, serrapeptase, bromelain, curcumin, pycnogenol. There's lots of different things. Again, I think Peter McCullough's product with spike defense or spike support it has a lot of those things in it. It just makes it easier to actually have that and take that. On terms of, pharmaceuticals I use on top of things are things that are actually antiplatelets, things like aspirin and Plavix, as well as things that are anticoagulation, which are things like Eliquis or Pradaxa. We call that triple therapy, and that's really the people that I work with out of South Africa and England. That's kind of how we've coined it, triple therapy, because you have two things that work on platelets, and the third thing is something that works on the fibrin, and it seems to help your body break down. It kind of tilts the balance. Your body is any kind of biological system, it's in a steady state. So unlike it's always like something's being torn down at the same time being built. So if we stop the things from being made and repaired and force the body only to break it down, then we kind of tilt the balance toward breakdown. And that's the end result is once you do that, you get more breakdown and you clean things out. But that's kind
If
of
someone wants to, is it primarily for people who have microclots, or is there something preventive? And of course, I'm the type that would just say, tell me where to get it and I'll get it, because who wants to have to piecemeal all these supplements? But
no.
is it just for those with?
No, so the Japanese have been using nattokinase, serrapeptase, bromelain for a long time, and it has a lot of benefits, even for people that just have coronary disease from cholesterol. It's a classic mechanism. I mean, it comes from a lot of these things are formed in food. Nattokinase comes from a natto, which is kind of a soybean that actually gets fermented in the
Bromelain is from pineapple, isn't it?
pineapple. Yeah, serrapeptase is from silkworms, lumbricinase is from earthworms. So again, these are all things that God kind of designed, and they are a part of these really cool mechanisms, and we're just kind of utilizing them. But those things are good for most people anyway. I'm actually somebody that would take, I take nattokinase and bromelain and the pycnogenol every day, as long as I can remember it, just because it's good for my vessels anyway. So unlike the medical therapy that I do, which does, those things people don't need to be on those forever, unless, there's some indication, and I use them for a short period of time. Most of those people, by the end of me putting them on those things, I do keep them on a lot of those natural things in perpetuity.
Can we provide in the show notes your source for those
Yeah,
as
yeah.
well as Dr.
Yeah, I can send you. I'll send you, Jamie, my even a little bit of a sheet on kind of overview of what I would kind of recommend for spike defense, or because COVID is still around. That's the other thing, and so a lot of people, especially, I mean, I think the best defense is a good offense in a sense that as opposed to the best offense is a good defense. But it's really being proactive and making sure your immune system is ready, but also being on things that are already good at getting rid of the crap that this thing makes. And so things, a lot of people that are already taking nattokinase, serapeptase, bromelain, pycnogenol, those kind of things, even when they get COVID, are going to do a lot better, meaning they're not going to have the residual effects. They're less likely to have kind of long COVID, those kind of things.
For those of us, and everyone has to make their own decision, but for those of us who say at this point, with what we know at this point, that we will not be getting another vaccine, do you have anything to say about that? Do you have any opinion?
No, I mean, I think that's a smart decision. I think I mean, that's the one thing I think that the public health establishment has done is they took a word called that's vaccine, and even doctors assume that all vaccines are the same, and in fact, they're not. Actually, the vaccines that have really been produced fairly recently are kind of pushing the boundaries. I mean, definitely the COVID mRNA vaccine pushed the boundaries of what we would call a vaccine. They're not the classic vaccine that we think of that we gave our children or you took in the 60s and 70s with, they're not these inactivated viral vaccines. These are fancy protein subunit utilizing lots of genetic or what we call adenovector kind or vector type things, and almost stimulating the immune system in a very almost beyond what you would suggest. But there's a reason for that. And unfortunately, like in medicine with a lot of things, there's a financial reason for that too. And so as I was testifying in front of the Judiciary Committee about 6 weeks ago, and it was interesting to have the congressman ask me, about safe and effective. And the funny thing is if it's truly safe and effective, why do they have blanket liability against any type of prosecution for harm? It's the only product that we have in America that has that. And I think and that's what we said at the end, if y'all say it's safe and effective, well, let's just remove the blanket liability. That'll make it easy. I mean, the typical market forces in America will take care of it if we remove the liability, but that's not the case. Actually, if somebody is injured by a vaccine, the Department of Justice own lawyers go against you, and you have to hire a lawyer I mean, it's what we call vaccine court. It's its own world. And no other product in America, I mean, if any other product had that kind of protection, both sides would be livid. But in this case, they're not. And but at the same time, they say, oh, they're safe and effective and nothing ever happens wrong with them. And if that's the case, then they don't need the protection. So that's your pretty good odd. I would be fine if the protection was removed, because then we would actually find out, they would be forced to make products that weren't pushing the limit.
And Jordan, I would like for you to share all of this information that people can utilize for the show notes, but that you do have an ally or more than one in Congress. Could you shout them out?
From Thomas Massie to Jim Jordan. On the Senate side, it's Roger Marshall out of Kansas, as well as Rand Paul. So those are people I interface with. When I go up there, it's actually, I mean, all of them, weird enough, are in some ways on my side, in some ways not. Again, we're talking about one side of the aisle, unfortunately, even though, I mean, I think it's broadening out, because some of the people that even I take care of are injured, and they're not necessarily the typical side you would think of. So, but Thomas Massie and Jim Jordan, Barry Moore. Barry Moore is a huge, he's a big, he's one of the guys fighting the right battles in Congress for us. So,
well, Jordan, I so appreciate your time, and I appreciate so much what you're doing. And for anyone watching and listening, do go to the show notes and all the ways to read Jordan's papers. Jordan, you've been on
the other thing
many
is
television.
if they want, and you can attach this to the end, but I have a website, the MV or microvascularresearch.org, mvresearch.org, and it has a lot of information, more specifically about iliac vein issues and the microvascular stuff. And that's one of the resources that we're utilizing because again, we're not a big academic institute, but we're trying to accumulate the data and get the data out there so we can help more people. Because at the end of the day, that's what we got to do to get more doctors to understand this. It doesn't, the way that information disseminates in today's world, requires publishing, and publishing is not necessarily the cheapest thing, or running trials. One of the
Mhm.
reasons that a lot of the things that people hear about in today's world is all pharmaceutical driven is because the pharmaceutical companies are the ones that have the money to
Yeah.
run big trials. So
Yeah.
anyway,
And can they also find out your podcast with Dr. Tankersley, America Out Loud, or with Dr. Tankersley?
yeah, they will. They can look at it there too.
And
Yes.
okay, and you're sharing all that. Well, thank you. Thank you. I'm so grateful. And until next time, Jordan, you stay safe and
All
have
right.
a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you, Jamie. Thank you
And
for
then
having
to
me.
everyone watching and listening, until next time, you have a fabulous rest of your day as well. Hi, everyone. I hope you enjoyed this episode of the SavvyCast. If you'll take the time to rate, review, and subscribe on iTunes, that would mean so much. As always, thank you for listening and have a blessed day.